We've imagined this world of ours through the lens of nation states for about 450 years. And at a time when nation states are struggling, they're ceding their sovereignty and struggling to deal with collective action problems, and international institutions are also struggling to deal with things like climate change, migration, terrorism, and the like, it may be more appropriate to start looking at the world through the lens of cities rather than nation states. We are an urban species. What you see in front of you right now is a visualization that looks at every single city in the world with more than 250,000 people. It's the first ever visualization of all cities in one single place, which is in itself remarkable. And it brings together a set of risks about the extent of fragility in our cities, as well as the resilience. The dots and the areas and the bars that are high indicate the population of cities, and the color indicates the degree of fragility. So if you're red, you got a higher level of fragility. If you're blue, a less. And it'll make more sense as I kind of proceed throughout this presentation. Have cities, in a way, in spite of their extraordinary growth over the last century, and the fact that more than 50% of the world's population live in them, and the fact that 80% of global GDP comes from them, have they triumphed? Are cities really the bulwark of our, the end point of our civilization in terms of our organization? Well, I think in some ways you could say they have demonstrated to be incredibly effective forms of organization. People who live in cities tend to live longer, they're more educated, they tend to earn more, and they tend to be more prosperous. So cities have managed to improve livelihoods around the world. But have they, in a way, triumphed in every sense? And I would argue that, in fact, we're facing a bit of an urban dilemma, because there are many cities that offer those goods, but there are many, many more in which we see rising risks, in which we see more and more fragility. Cities around the world are responsible for 75% of carbon emissions, 80% of resource consumption. So cities are, as much as they're offering goods, they're also proving to be a risk around the world. What do we know about our cities around the world? What you're seeing is the height of the line represents the speed of population growth, and you'll see over a 15-year period changing levels of speed of population growth. We know that the number and the size of cities have grown spectacularly. Our urban population right now is 4 billion people. It'll be 6 billion in just 30 years. Now think about that for 1 minute. 75% of the world's population will live in cities by 2050. 54% live in it today. In the 1950s, just 30% of the world's population lived in cities. In the 1800s, just 3% of the world's population lived in cities. So we're talking about a dramatic increase in the urban population in a relatively short period of time. And this population growth is not, in the future, is not going to be evenly distributed. It's going to be highly concentrated in the global south. So in the future, 90% of all future urban population growth is going to take place in Africa and Asia. It's not going to be taking place in Western Europe or North America, where in fact populations are stabilizing or decreasing. And 40% of that growth is going to take place in just 3 countries: Nigeria, India, and China. 2 billion people will also be living in slums. So this is not population growth that's going to be evenly distributed within income groups. We're going to see a massive increase also in our slums. In the process, cities are forging new and innovative forms of collaboration. We're seeing international networks of cities emerging. There are over 200 intercity networks around the planet trying to lobby on behalf of these growing and thriving cities. But in the course of this rapid urbanization, if we move to the super and hyper and mega city slide, we're seeing cities that the kinds of the likes we've never seen before. We're seeing, for the first time in history, a massive expansion of cities of over 1 million people. Keep in mind that, Rome was the only city to reach 1 million people 2,000 years ago. It took 1,800 years for another city to reach 1 million people. Today we have 29 megacities with 1 million people or more. We also have what are called hypercities, cities with 20 to 40 million people. Take, for example, Cairo or Delhi or Dhaka. These are cities that have 20, 25, 30 million people. We've never seen urban agglomerations of this kind before. And then we have super cities, especially in places like China. And if we go down towards the Beijing, Tianjin area of China, you have an urban conglomeration. And I wanted Pan to explain a little bit more about what's going on in here.
Right, here we have Beijing-Tianjin area. We call it an urban cluster. And Beijing city alone, we have 21 million people, and Tianjin, another city, only 100 kilometers in distance, another 14 million people. So these two cities together, we would have 40 million people or so. But the surrounding area, we have even more. Why they grow so huge? Simply because of job opportunities, investment, and also better social services like medical care and also educational facilities. And in particular, if you see these huge cities, we have the infrastructure.
So we're talking about an area, a city that's over 40 million people, and if you take the entire delta, 130 million people squeezed within an urban area. We've never seen cities like this before. And in the process, they're reshaping our geopolitics, our geoeconomics. Global supply chains are now running through cities as much as they run through our countries. And fragility we're defining as a cluster of risks that will result in the ability of municipal authorities to ensure oversight of law and order and basic services within a city jurisdiction. So when you have this clustering of risks, often you'll see cities ceding their ability to govern and ultimately resulting in a certain form of fragility. So we've taken 11 core risks that we were able to identify from across 2,100 cities. These include population growth. When a city moves above 3.5 or 4% per year in terms of population growth, that often in the literature, in the scientific literature, is correlated with a high risk of fragility. When it goes below zero into the negatives, likewise, it also can signal certain forms of fragility. Income inequality, gene inequality. So the level of income inequality within a city is also highly correlated with different forms of fragility in a city. Unemployment rates, homicide, terrorist killings, conflict in the city, riots, access to electricity as a proxy for services, air pollution, flood risk, earthquakes, and cyclones. So we've gathered data on all these cities across 15 years, and we've aggregated them on a score of 0 to 5. And so the higher you are in fragility, the redder your city, the lower you are, the bluer you are. And so this is all demonstrated, I think, on this particular visualization. This tool was developed with the World Economic Forum as a kind of experiment to see if we could do what we've done for nation states, all 193 of them, if we could do a similar kind of exercise for trying to map out different types of metrics at the city scale. And remarkably, it's not been done before. So this is what you're seeing is the first ever attempt to try to plot spatially and temporally the distribution of risk at the city scale. One of the functions, of course, is that you're able to hover over any city and it will give you the breakdown of the metrics. A secondary function is if you press shift and click, what you'll see is a timeline plus a projected fragility score over the next 15 years using a pretty basic linear regression. I recognize that cities are complex ecosystems with very, very dynamic, perhaps non-linear metabolisms. But this was an effort to at least provide a counterfactual for urban planners to think about what might happen in the city if nothing is to be done, given past trends. In addition, you can aggregate multiple cities. We won't show you that today, but you can put multiple cities together and cluster them. And the reason I'm telling you this is because all of you can access this tool right now online. It's publicly available for all, and the data set's available for all at fragilecities.igarape.org.br. These are the cities that have relatively high fragility scores, above 2.5 on this 0 to 5 point scale. What's interesting about this, first of all, is that fragility is growing over time. If you start in 2000, there are a relatively small number of cities reporting these kinds of scores. As years go on, we see a higher clustering. About 11% of the sample of 2,100 of the largest cities in the world have high fragility scores. Just 13%, so less than 350, have low fragility scores, between 0 and 1.5. And the vast majority are somewhere in the middle, oscillating up and down. So that's, I think, a significant point. The second significant point, as I already mentioned, is that we're seeing an increase over time. And the increase is not happening just in low-income settings, where you've seen a 26% increase over the last 15 years. It's also happening in medium-income settings, where we've seen a 14% increase, and in high-income settings, where we've seen an 11% increase in the number of cities that can be described as suffering from fragility. Fragility, as you'd expect, is hyper-concentrated in particular areas and places. This slide shows you the height of the city, the population of the city, and of course the colors designate the level of fragility. You'll see a high concentration, and this hasn't always been this way, but a high concentration, if we go through the timeline, especially in parts of Syria, Iraq, of course, from 2003-4 onwards, in the case of Iraq, 2011 onwards, in the case of Syria, down in Yemen since 2008. Somalia, if we were to roll down, lights up, over the last, frankly, the last 10, 15 years. West Africa, also in Nigeria, you'll see a clustering of cities around Lagos, Port Harcourt, Wari, Abuja, which also have experienced a rising level of fragility over time. And if we go towards Asia, on the next, you'll also see a similar kind of story. In Afghanistan, you'll see a number of cities since 2000, relatively recently, or since the intervention, a rise in places like Kabul and Herat, up through northern and parts of Pakistan, into India, like Lucknow and Patna are suffering from acute levels of fragility, down to Myanmar. The Philippines, you'll see, has a high concentration, both north and south. And an interesting story is that China, in spite of really turbo urbanization, an incredible story of urbanization, has remained relatively low fragile over the last 15 years. There's been some issues in the interior, mostly to do with rising levels of pollution, as well as the rate of urbanization, which suggests that there are threats and dangers and risks of fragility. But the story, I think, here that's interesting is how China has managed to avoid, in a way, the fragility risks. And I think you'll talk about that in a moment.
Well, I think that this is a really good case because, in China, we have some 750 million people living in the urbanized world. And socially and economically, we are very stable and economically dynamic. The only thing in China is that the environmental constraints like water contamination, resource shortages, and also, air pollution. But socially, you can see it's very safe. In Beijing, Shanghai, these cities, we have over 20 million people. They are very safe. Electricity is everywhere, is guaranteed. There is no shortage of energy supply. And also transport, mobility is so convenient. Healthcare and education, schools, that's everywhere, all the new communities, because, for a new area for urban development, in many cities, we have at least, over 100 square kilometers of area lined up, for development. And then the planning is made simultaneously for industrial parks, for education, for medical care, for government, for everything. So I think that the planning is very important. And then the infrastructure, because, with such a huge city, mobility is a huge, really problem.
Obviously, visualizations only tell you part of a story. They're intended to provoke a conversation. They don't resolve all the causal questions you might have. But I want to end with one final story here around Syria, since it's an area that we've been focusing on a lot at the World Economic Forum. We've had a horrific conflict there since at least 2011. And the conflict in Syria tends to be described as a political contest, often over the existing regime, led by grievances from below, having started in 2011. And I think what's interesting about the visualizations is that you can actually see other kinds of stories emerge when trying to describe complex conflicts, as what we're seeing in Syria. Syria actually experienced a dramatic drought that started in the early 2000s and really hit a peak around 2005, 2006. And as you can see from the visualization, we had a dramatic wipeout of harvests in the north and northeast of the country around 2005, 2006, 2007. 75% of the harvest collapsed in those years. 85% of the livestock died off. 1.5 million people were internally displaced into cities, especially cities like Homs and Damascus and Aleppo. And if we go to the visualization that shows us refugee flows, circles show the cities, and the growth of the cities demonstrates their fragility. And what you see here is expanding fragility in Syrian cities from 2011, 2012, and then an explosion in 2013 of refugees out of cities across Syria. And this suggests not only that issues around climate risks and erosion can affect the fragility in cities by rapidly increasing populations in cities, but also that fragile cities may be a lead indicator for different forms of migration, including refugee migration. So by combining different kinds of visualizations, different kinds of data, you can tell, I think, some pretty compelling stories about very, very complex phenomena.